Harivamsham, translated by Shri Debroy. Introduction. The Harivamsham is not a Purana, though it is often loosely referred to as a Purana. The word Purana means ancient, and as texts, the Puranas are ancient accounts. There are many texts that are referred to as Puranas. To be classified as a proper Purana, a text needs to cover 5 topics: Sarga, the original creation; Pratisarga, the periodic cycles of secondary creation and destruction; Vamsa, the genealogies of gods and rishis; Manvantara, the eras presided over by a Manu; the solar and lunar dynasties. In lists of the Puranas, there are the great Puranas, the Mahapuranas, and the minor Puranas, the Upapuranas. There is no consensus on what counts as Upapurana and what does not. Lists vary from one part of the country to another. However, there is consensus on the list of Mahapuranas. There are 18 of these, and their names are Agni Purana, Bhagawata Purana, Brahma Purana, Brahmanda Purana, Brahmavaivarta Purana, Garuda Purana, Kurma Purana, Linga Purana, Markandeya Purana, Matsya Purana, Narada Purana, Padma Purana, Shiva Purana, Skanda Purana, Vamana Purana, Varaha Purana, Vayu Purana, and Vishnu Purana. In some cases, the Bhavishya Purana is included in the list of 18. When that is done, either the Shiva Purana or the Vayu Purana is included in the list, but not both. In greater or lesser degrees, all the Mahapuranas satisfy those 5 characteristics, the Vishnu Purana more than the others. The Mahabharata was composed by the sage Krishna Dvaipayana Veda Vyasa. There were many regional versions of this Sanskrit text. Between 1919 and 1966, the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune shifted through these various versions and brought out a critical edition of this Sanskrit text. Since unabridged translations of the Mahabharata in English are rare, a translation was published by Penguin Books India between 2010 and 2014, and a box set has been brought out in 2015. The Harivamsa needs to be read in conjugation with Mahabharata and not independently. This translation should also be read in conjunction with the Mahabharata translation and not independently. It is a continuation, and incidents and characters will not necessarily be clear without that continuity. After the critical edition of Mahabharata was published, the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute also published a critical edition of the Harivamsa as a Khila, meaning supplement or appendix to the Mahabharata text. The Mahabharata composed by Bhagavan Vedavyasa includes the Harivamsam. This translation is based on the critical edition of the Harivamsam, as was the case with the Mahabharatam translation. 2 points need to be made about this critical text. First, at the risk of some subjectivity, the quality of the editing in the critical version of the Harivamsam is not as good as that of the main Mahabharata. In some instances, we have the temerity to point this out. Second, there are versions of the Harivamsam floating around in Sanskrit with translations in vernacular languages. Compared to those, the critical text has done some ruthless slashing. We will return to this point later. Therefore, many incidents one associates with the Harivamsam are missing from the critical text and will also be missed in this translation. To the best of my knowledge, there are only 2 unabridged translations of the Harivamsam in English. The first was done by Shri Manmatanath Datta in 1897, after he had completed his translation of the Mahabharata. The second is an ongoing online translation. The pattern followed in this Harivamsam translation also follows that of the Mahabharata translation. The intention is to make the translation as close to the original Sanskrit text as is possible. In the process, the English is not always as smooth as might have been the case had one taken more liberties. If a reader has the Sanskrit in front, there will be an exact correspondence between the Sanskrit and the English. This cannot be achieved with a verse translation, though the Harivamsham is in verse. Hence, the translation is in prose. Some words cannot satisfactorily be translated, dharma being a case in point. Therefore, such words are not translated. This is a translation. It isn't an interpretation. However, a straightforward translation may not make everything clear to the reader. This explanation is done through footnotes and should be sufficient to explain the text. Because this translation is meant to be accessible to the ordinary reader, there was a conscious decision to avoid diacritical marks. Names, proper names, and geographical names are therefore rendered as close phonetically as is possible. The absence of diacritical marks sometimes can cause confusion, such as between Vasudeva and Vasudeva. When there is a danger of confusion not obvious from the text, this has been avoided by rendering Krishna as Vasudeva and Krishna's father as Vasudeva. What is the Harivamsha about? In general sense, it is about Krishna's life. When we first encounter Krishna in the Mahabharata, he is already an adult. Where was he born? What were his childhood and other exploits, those not recounted in the Mahabharata? The Harivamsham answers such questions. But such questions are also answered in the Puranas, at least some of them. The belief is that after composing the Mahabharata, Vedavyasa composed the Puranas. The Mahabharata is believed to have had 100,000 shlokas or couplets. The critical edition of the Mahabharata has a little short of 75,000 shlokas. Even that, in the 10-volume translation, converts into something like 2.25 million words. Together, 18 Mahapuranas amount to another 400,000 shlokas. The Mahapuranas differ greatly in length, from around 10,000 shlokas in the Brahma Purana to more than 80,000 shlokas in the Skanda Purana. Nor were they necessarily composed at one point in time, with a range of anything between 2nd century CE to 10th century CE. In all probability, Vedavyasa composed an original Purana that is now lost, and all the present Puranas are additions and embellishments on that lost original. The Puranas are classified in different ways. For instance, some emphasize creation and are therefore identified with Brahma. Some are identified with Vishnu and some are identified with Shiva. But these are not neat silos, and all of them traverse similar ground with minor variations in stories too. Among the ones identified with Vishnu and known as Vaishnava Puranas are the Vishnu Purana and the Bhagawata Purana. Most of what is found in the Harivamsham will be found in these two texts. In the Mahabharata, Krishna may have been elevated to the status of a divinity in some parts, but in other parts, he does display human attributes. Purely in those relative terms, in these two Puranas and in the Harivamsham, Krishna's divine status is primary and the human traits are secondary. Once he composed the Mahabharata, the Harivamsham and the Puranas, Vedavyasa taught these to his disciple, Vaishampayana. Janamejaya was the son of Parikshit, Abhimanyu's son. On the occasion of King Janamejaya's snake sacrifice, Vaishampayana recounted all three texts to Janamejaya and the assembled sages. On a subsequent occasion, Ugrashrava Sauti recounted the same story to sages who had assembled for a sacrifice in the Naimisha forest. It is by no means essential that the Harivamsham, as we have it today, was necessarily composed at a single point in time. The earlier parts, and it is impossible to disentangle the earlier from the latter, probably go back to the 1st or 2nd century CE. Standard texts of the Harivamsham are divided into 3 sections or parvas: Harivamsa Parva, Vishnu Parva, and Bhavishya Parva. In general, Harivamsa Parva has stories that precede Krishna. There are stories about the Vrishni lineage, but not about Krishna. Vishnu Parva is about Krishna's exploits, and Bhavishya Parva is about the future, about Kali Yuga. Compared to non-critical versions that float around, the critical text of Harivamsam has been mercilessly slashing across all 3 sections. What remains is 118 chapters, 45 chapters in Harivamsa Parva, 68 chapters in Vishnu Parva, and 5 chapters in Bhavishya Parva. There are 2,392 shlokas in Harivamsa Parva, 3,368 shlokas in Vishnu Parva, and 205 shlokas in Bhavishya Parva. There are thus 5,965 shlokas in all in Harivamsam. Non-critical versions will often have double this number, reflective of the slashing. Instead of numbering the chapters within the 3 sections separately, we have used a continuous numbering, one that Sanskrit text also uses.